The First Osean War was the start of what many see as a signature rivalry between two nations that would influence world geopolitics for the next 100 years. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, the Osean Federation slowly expanded into what it has become in the 20th and 21st centuries, but it wasn't always the superpower it's currently attributed to be. Prior to the 20th century, the Great Lakes region, as well as the Futuro Canal connecting the northern and southern bodies of water, was not controlled by the Osean Federation. Various monarchies throughout eastern Osea had fought numerous wars in the past over these vital waterways. A large portion of these nations were made up of the ethnic group known as Balkans, although there were others including the Saponish, as well as the Nords much further east. These countries shared much resentment toward each other in the past, but naturally tensions had begun to simmer down between them as a larger threat loomed, that threat of course being the Osean Federation. The Kingdom of Sapon had control of the southern end of the canal leading into Arid Bay, but the largest country in the area, a Balkan country known as the United Southern Kingdoms, which commonly was referred to then and even now as Ustio, occupied the Great Lakes region, as well as the northern end of the canal leading into the ocean. It was the largest nation in eastern Osea, made up of South Balka, the Great Lakes, modern-day Ustio, and the northern part of modern-day Ratio. However, despite outward looks, it wasn't the most powerful due to internal divisions within the government and military. The kingdoms of Rekta and Gebed made up the easternmost territories the Balkan peoples inhabited. Geographically, compared to modern times, Rekta controlled Wheelvakia. Gebed controlled what's now known as Fado. The heartland of the Balkan peoples was north of the Voldrak Mountains, which was an area controlled by the reinstated Kingdom of North Belka. Throughout history, there had always been a natural separation between North and South Belka. Ustio, aka the United Southern Kingdoms, for a time controlled North Belka, but because of the great difficulty of maintaining stability and control in the region through a large mountain range, they eventually deemed it beyond the nation's scope, and so released North Belka in the 1870s. In 1901, tensions grew exponentially between the collective of Balkan nations and the Osean Federation, when Osea declared war on the Kingdom of Sapon, swiftly defeated them, and annexed the Arlen region, allowing the Oseans complete control of the southern Futuro Canal. The Osean Federation, with its daunting military and manpower, as well as unrivaled naval capabilities, now surrounded the Balkan nations. Fear swept across the Balkan kingdoms. The Oseans were an enemy like no other, a federation made up of dozens of formerly independent countries with a seemingly endless amount of territory and men to call upon. Ironically, this fear of conflict united the formerly hostile nations. The Balkan kingdoms of North Belka, Rekta, Gebed, and the United Southern Kingdoms formed an alliance known as the Eastern Powers. Sapon was invited as well, but ultimately refused to join initially. In late June of 1905, the spark everyone was anticipating finally came. To this day, it's unknown if the Osean government was responsible, though many historians believe it was. The Ustian monarch of the United Southern Kingdoms, who had been attempting to achieve healthier relations with Osea to no avail, was shot through the chest while visiting the border town of Rutherford. The Balkan peoples, who were outraged at this event, demanded justice. The United Southern Kingdom's Prince Regent took power after the monarch's then still attempted assassination, as he simultaneously ordered the military to begin mobilizing. This decision was in spite of the other Eastern Powers nations compelling the Prince Regent not to do so. A week and a half later, on July 9th, the monarch of the United Southern Kingdoms died from his injuries, and subsequently the United Southern Kingdoms declared a state of open war on the Osean Federation, despite being ill-prepared to wage said war. None of the other Eastern Powers nations had completed mobilization yet, leaving Ustio temporarily on its own to fight Osea. Osea took the border city of Wesson quickly, with little resistance. Simultaneously, its fleet sailed into the Great Lakes from the south, with nothing Ustio could do to prevent a complete naval collapse. The first few weeks of the war put on full display the United Southern Kingdom's military ineptitude and lack of cohesion between units. Since Osea couldn't pass through the Voldrak Mountains from the west, for the time being the rest of the Balkan nations were safe from invasion. The First Battle of the Kreskere on August 2, 1905, was a humiliating defeat which forced the United Southern Kingdoms to give up Directus without so much as a defense. Their military collapse forced the remnants of the army to retreat north, just south of the Voldrak Mountains, and to the west of Rekta. Finally, by August 29th, North Belka completed mobilization, followed by Rekta on September 2nd and Gebet on September 12th. Multiple decisive battles took place between North Belka with its allies Rekta and Gebet and Osia between September 15th and October 4th, including the Battle of Steer Castle on September 27th. These battles showcased North Belkan military prowess as they turned the tide of war at Waldreich. Rekta and Gebet as a united force also saw success on the Far Eastern Front. North Belka combined their armies with the remnants of the United Southern Kingdoms, then began attempting to outflank Osia as they raced for the Northern Sea. Neither side succeeded in outflanking the other. Rekta and Gebet as well saw no success in the south as they reached Sapin's border. By the end of 1905, both sides had dug miles of trenches on their respective front lines. Little ground was regained in Ustio by the North Belkans, which was an issue, as it allowed the Osean fleet to sail into the North Sea and blockade the Eastern Powers' nations. The next year, throughout 1906, many bloody battles were fought, especially between the Oseans fighting Rekta and Gebet. But again, little to no ground was gained by either side. North Belka, on the other hand, had begun development of a new type of weapon to break the stalemate in the winter, that weapon being bomber aircraft. North Belkan General Franklin Golnitz proposed the idea of using modified reconnaissance aeroplanes to target enemy installations from the sky. Though the winter airstrike campaign did a number on Osean logistics and encampments, it wasn't enough to break the stalemate. Osia quickly began to mimic these tactics throughout 1907, and the Eastern Powers soon lost the initiative. 1908 then came and went with well over 1 million casualties on both sides combined, including civilians. This year saw especially brutal fighting when the Oseans launched their miscoordinated offensives at Tauberg, and suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on only the first day. The Belkan home front was in a desperate situation too, and the blockade needed to end. 1909 saw the next huge development in aeronautics and military strategy, as well as the big break the Eastern Powers needed: air superiority fighters and shock troop tactics. With complete air dominance, Allied Belkan bombers would arrive and destroy hostile forward positions and weapons installations. Following the bombings, Belka would hammer the enemy emplacements with artillery, allowing elite stormtroopers to get in close and take enemy trenches and defenses. With these innovation in tactics and technology, Belka began the Great Spring Offensives of 1909, also called Königschlacht, or the King's Battle. These offensives saw some of the most costly battles in the war for both sides, but a majority of them went greatly in the Eastern Powers' favor. And on May 13th, during the Second Battle of the Kriskere, a combined force of Usians, Rektans, Gebetans, and North Belkans liberated Directus, where Ustio's soldiers famously rang church bells all throughout the city, signifying their liberation and freedom from Osean tyranny. The next day, on May 14th, seeing an opportunity to reclaim its holdings on the vital Futuro Canal, the Kingdom of Sapin joined the Eastern Powers and declared war on Osia. Due to the rapid collapse of the front line, Osia was unable to pass its northern fleet through the Great Lakes into Arid Bay, and because of Sapin's entrance into the war, followed by subsequent losses at Lumen and the Futuro Canal itself, the Osean fleet was stranded in the Great Lakes with no route of escape. Osia, in desperation, decided to reconsolidate its forces for a double defense of both Wesson and Rutherford. In late September, the sieges on both cities broke through, allowing Belkan expansion into the Osean Federation mainland. However, an early cold front stopped both armies in October, and the Belkans wouldn't continue their offensive until March of the next year. Resuming the war in the spring of 1910, a coalition of South Belkan forces attacked Osia from Rutherford, spearheading an invasion deep into the mainland. The ultimate goal being to take the capital of Osia, which at the time was Bana City. North Belkan forces were responsible for capturing the cities of Sarsfield and Durant, which they managed to achieve by mid-June with impressive speed. On July 25th, the coalition of South Belkan forces sacked Bana City. Osia, in response, moved its capital to Arid. Seeing no end in sight and no chance of recovery, Osia requested an armistice which took effect on August 2nd. The terms of the treaty were harsh. All of the Great Lakes region, as well as lands as far west as Sarsfield, would be ceded to the Belkan nations, and so would the western portion of Arid Bay. Sapin reclaimed the Arlen region it had previously lost to Osia. Both Sapin and Belka would jointly own the Futuro Canal. The Belkan nations themselves chose to unify under one flag, and from then on became known as the Belkan Federation. It was agreed upon in large part because of their contribution to the war effort that the royalty of the Kingdom of North Belka would be recognized as the official crown for the new federation. However, nobles and royalty in the other Belkan lands would retain their social status in the new government. Modern-day censuses estimate there to have been around 30 million casualties in the First Osean War, around half of which were deaths. Most of the casualties inflicted were caused by disease, especially because the Verusian soldiers shipped over from Osean colonies to fight in the war carried new pathogens that the Osean soldiers, as well as civilians, held no immunity towards. In the 2 years after the war, one of the most deadly pandemics in history ravaged the Osean continents and killed around 5% of all peoples living in Osea and South Osea combined. Around 30 million people, doubling the amount of deaths that occurred in the war. Though rarely talked about in pop culture, the First Osean War changed the world forever and has become known as the segue into the modern era.